Max Headroom here with... This is my guest.
Yeah, you say you don't know where the macho man is coming from? Yeah, you're right. You don't know anything about the macho man, Randy Savage, and where I'm coming from. Because it's mind-boggling to you, yeah!
The IFBB for a time had struggles with NABBA to become the biggest bodybuilding federation in the world, but through strict business practices, visionary ideas, and insane promotional skills, they did it, surpassing all other federations and creating the most ambitious show in bodybuilding history with the Mr. Olympia. But they weren't out of the woods yet, with competitions like the WBBG and of course the NABBA still biting at their heels. How could they overcome this? Many people regard Pumping Iron as Arnold's biggest defining moment and breakout hit into movies. However, it also put bodybuilding on the map and opened the eyes of the common public to the sport. Of course, a movie revolving around the Mr. Olympia held in South Africa made the show and the IFBB itself have a comfortable lead ahead of the competition as all eyes were on the Weeder Boys. This marked the peak of bodybuilding in most people's eyes, as the late 70s had some of the most incredible faces, shows and iconic moments the sport has ever seen. The next decade, however, wouldn't be so glamorous. Starting off with two of the worst shows in bodybuilding history, many competitors gave up on the IFBB. The fans themselves started to doubt the show and the federation that ran it, meaning the sport went into a little dark age, with the federation being unable to decide where they wanted to take the sport without the superstars of Arnold and Mensa. The following years would be more giving, with one of the greatest of all time reigning with utmost dominance, a dominance never seen to this point. But it would be closer to the end of his reign when tragedy, or what felt like tragedy, would hit the IFBB once more. But let's rewind a little. As bodybuilding was suffering from poor judging and uninteresting champions, another American profession was entering its golden age. From humble beginnings on one of many federations across America, the WWF was about to come into its element. It had been run for decades now by a man of the name Vince McMahon Sr., the man who almost put the federation on the map, but after a premature death in 1984, he would never see his true vision come to life. Luckily for the WWF, a well-trained manager who worked at the company and was passionate about the sport would take over and take the company to new heights. This man was Vince McMahon. In a tumultuous time for both the WWF and McMahon family, Vince was able to take the reins, and through strict business practices, visionary ideas and insane promotional skills, wrestling as a sport garnered nationwide acclaim and popularity that it had never seen before. With his vision coming in the shape of WrestleMania 1 held in 1985 at Madison Square Garden in New York, shown to almost 20,000 people in attendance and over 1 million people watching worldwide. It was clear that wrestling was on the way up, but not only wrestling, but Vince McMahon. Vince couldn't do it alone, however, as he wasn't the one wrestling, meaning he had to take it to the drawing board in creating larger-than-life characters to bring the company into the spotlight, with the likes of Hulk Hogan, Andre the Giant and Randy Savage being household names today for even non-wrestling fans. Larger-than-life characters that people could latch onto, and with incredible rivalries throughout the sport, people couldn't help but watch what was going on. This excitement was ignited even more with the larger-than-life promos creating an aura that no other sport had. Not only did the over-the-top characters and theatrics demonstrate Vince's love for entertaining people, but it also showed his love for great physiques, a staple that was seen in almost every single mainstream wrestler. Two things that would bite him in the backside only a few years later. But for now, wrestling was on top of the world, and although bodybuilding was facing turmoil, it still had a naturally larger-than-life person who was competing, one that would butt heads with Vince McMahon in an unexpected event. Tom Platz was destined to be an ordinary bodybuilder. Yes, he had impressive legs which got him onto the magazines, but overall he wasn't going places in terms of popularity or influence in the sport. Well, not yet anyways. In his first two Olympias in 1979 and 1980, he placed both 8th and 9th behind the likes of Boyer Coe, Frank Zane and Mike Mensa. But due to the 1980 show being as controversial as it was, people had lost their heart in the sport and felt apprehensive with the upcoming year. However, due to the light lineup in the 1981 Olympia, it allowed those fans to pay attention to new faces. Someone like Tom Platz, who aced his physique that year, quickly becoming the fan favourite of the show, with there being roaring ovations every time people saw him. For most people, he was the clear winner, and his radiant confidence that he had on stage just solidified that completely. But he lost. To a man with no legs and gyno, his best chance of winning an Olympia in his career ruined. This wasn't the end for Tom Platz though, but it was just the beginning. Tom Platz could be called one of the first uncrowned kings in most people's eyes, and at the time there was uproar across the whole fandom that would be felt in the sport to this day. The surprising thing is, the happiest person at this time was Tom Platz. Off the back of the show, he was able to capture the heart and attention of the fan base, which allowed him to have opportunities to go worldwide and grow his career potentially even more than if he had won the show. Every show that followed the 1981 Mr. Olympia would have people roaring at the sight of Tom Platz, even though he looked worse and worse each year, all the way up until he retired in 1987. Yet the love people had for him never went away, and he carried it all the way through into seminars, guest posing and appearances worldwide. Eventually, he would come into a certain Mr. McMahon, and an opportunity would arise that Tom Platz couldn't second guess. With him attempting to use the love people had for him that he had used in all of his endeavours throughout the years and put it into something that was about to shake up the industry and send shockwaves throughout the sport. Now, Tom Platz may have impacted the hearts and the fans of the sport until this point, but no one impacted the sport itself quite like...
Sweetheart, we're married.
Consider that a divorce.
Arnold himself isn't really important to this story, however his influence definitely is, and not the influence that you're expecting. When thinking about the influence of the sport of bodybuilding, many people may think of Dorian Yates, who changed the look of the sport entirely, but Arnold definitely influenced the culture around the sport a lot more. We have of course his impact on the sport's popularity through the movie Pumping Iron and his subsequent movies that followed, as well as his own show, The Arnold Classic. Now, the Arnold Classic is important for many reasons. Firstly, the fact that it offered competition to a show that had zero competition at the time, meaning the Olympia had to up its game, stakes and prize money as the Arnold was on its tail, something another show would try to do shortly after. However, the inaugural Arnold Classic in 1989 was important for many reasons most people wouldn't expect. Reasons that set in motion the ideal circumstances for Vince McMahon. That was something that bodybuilders feared at the time and something no one wanted to talk about. Steroid usage. Due to new drug testing laws in sports, bodybuilders had a world of hurt coming their way in the following years, and it started with the Arnold Classic. Although not causing too many waves for the Arnold Classic itself, the lineup was solid and the show itself was a success, the repercussions would be felt in the Olympia itself only a year later, leaving the floor wide open for competition. The 1990 Mr. Olympia competition was a breaking point for the Olympia and the IFBB as a whole. Now, it most likely wouldn't have been the end of the Olympia, but it was close to losing its tight grip on the bodybuilding industry. The Arnold Classic, although having to impress bodybuilding fans and introduce them to a new show that people can enjoy and be a part of, the Mr. Olympia is the biggest show in the world, meaning it has to not only meet expectations for the fans, but it's also in competition with itself, having to better itself year after year. A feat the Olympia was able to accomplish every year since it was first held in both grandiose and lineups. However, with every changing drug law, the Olympia must have been stressed before the 1990 show, and it didn't turn out well. Many bodybuilders had in fact failed the drug test they took, meaning the lineup for the show was incredibly lackluster compared to the ones just gone, making the fans of bodybuilding once again disappointed and left disheartened by the biggest show in the sport. But it wasn't depressing for everyone that year. During the expo of the show, Vince McMahon of all people hired a booth on the floor to promote his new bodybuilding magazine, Bodybuilding Lifestyles. In doing so, he hoped to raise awareness for that, and of course, the Olympia allowed him to do so. A magazine promoted by one of the greatest promoters in history that brought eyes to bodybuilding, and consequently the Olympia is great for the sport as a whole. What the IFBB and the Olympia didn't know is that the magazine wasn't all Vince was there to promote. Seeing an opportunity with all the disappointed fans, he started to hand out flyers for the World Bodybuilding Federation, a new federation that promised better bodybuilders and events for the fans and better pay and treatment for the competitors themselves. With the Mr. Olympia taking a huge misstep, it left the door wide open for Vince McMahon's WBF to take over, and it so happened that a lot of the IFBB star power had now become free agents. And with Lee Haney approaching the end of his career, the IFBB needed a new star, one that was going to carry the sport into the next decade, and they had one. Unfortunately, with the lack of paychecks, they almost lost him. Dorian Yates had a meteoric rise in bodybuilding, with him taking over the sport out of nowhere and being untouchable for years to come, with him never being beaten after 1991. However, what many people didn't know is that this almost didn't happen. Dorian Yates grew up poor and in fact lived in a council flat in a rough area of Birmingham, England, even whilst he was competing as a pro. And this demonstrates an issue with bodybuilding that was heavily prevalent at the time, and that was money. Yes, the IFBB was still the biggest federation in the world, and the Mr. Olympia was and still is the biggest show, however, you didn't get a lot of payouts back then. Nowadays, although still not being paid as much as they should, the competitors have a huge opportunity with social media and sponsorships that they did not have back then. This meant the bodybuilders had to compete in multiple shows throughout the years to make a living. Now, the best you could have is being hired by the Weedy Company and guest posing as well as TV shows, then you can make a solid living and even become wealthy off of the sport. At the start of his career though, Dorian still had nothing, and after the 1991 Night of Champions win, he had earned a total of $12,000, which wasn't enough to have a good living. However, after the Night of Champions win, Tom Platz, who was one of Dorian's heroes when he started bodybuilding, approached Dorian with an opportunity to compete in the WBF where he would be able to make hundreds of thousands a year. Dorian at this point seriously considered it and was flown out in first class to the WWF studios at the time, where he was shown around and met Vince McMahon himself. Dorian was initially impressed by it all, but he had one concern which he raised with them, and that was he considered himself a real athlete and didn't want to be involved in theatrics and over-the-top stories like the WWF had with people like Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage. They assured him that he would be taken seriously and that it wouldn't be fake or predetermined, and in that moment, Dorian had a serious decision to make. He declined. Ultimately though, the WBF was not discouraged. Everything seemed to be going Vince's way before the first show in June of 1991. He had the momentum built up from his previous accomplishments from the WWF, as well as the lackluster times being had in the Olympia side of the sport. He had an all-star cast of promising bodybuilders at the time like Danny Padilla, a veteran of the sport, Mike Christian and Gary Stridham, all men who had done reasonably well in the Olympia previously. His goal was to bring bodybuilding to the same height as the WWF and make bodybuilding a national sport and potentially international. With that, there was high ambitions and angst to see what would happen on the day of the show. Leading up to the show, it became apparent that this wouldn't be run like the Olympia. They held a press conference before the show similar to the Olympia where they announced some interesting comments.
I believe that the third round should be entertainment and should be judged as entertainment. So I'm looking forward to Hollywood special effects, sound effects, and some major performances by the guys.
Would like to think Dorian was watching this at this time and thinking that he may have made the right decision. This was at a time when Vince was using any gimmick in the book for the WWF, trying anything to find new stars after the wrestling craze of the 80s was over. There was still a promise of fair judging and all-out proper bodybuilding. So how was the show? Good. The show had brought entertainment and aura never before seen in bodybuilding, interesting stage designs and promotion throughout. But ultimately, the show of bodybuilding is the bodybuilders, and they in fact brought some impressive physiques along with some interesting and captivating posing routines. And Gary Stridham, who was all in all impressive, won the show. So, it was good. Well, those were the positives. And for its inaugural show, there weren't many bad things. The main problem of the show wasn't what it did specifically, but more of what it set up for the year to come. To add to that entertainment value that Platz and McMahon alluded to, they attempted something that many people didn't want: theatrics and stage performance. Take a look at a posing routine from the 91 Olympia and compare it to the 1991 WBF show. Throughout bodybuilding history, we've had nicknames for the guys. Arnold was the Austrian Oak, Platz himself was the Golden Eagle, Frank Zane was the Chemist, Robbie Robertson Black Prince, and Sergio Oliva was the Myth. And that's all they are: nicknames. Nicknames that are based on something that they did or them as people. Vince saw this differently. Take Danny Padilla for instance. Danny, being a shorter guy, got the nickname the Giant Killer. In the IFBB that was Danny's nickname, but in the WBF it was his character. See, each bodybuilder had their own character, similar to the WWF at the time. Aaron Baker was the Dark Angel, Mike Christian was the Iron Warrior, Barry DeMay was the Flexing Dutchman, and there were many others with characters. There also was whatever this is. Apart from the drawbacks of the show of the over-top theatrics, the show itself was deemed a success. The venue was busy and we saw some great physiques. However, the aim of the WBF was to bring bodybuilding more into the mainstream and make it into something such as wrestling that was a household American sport. And did it succeed? The initial numbers didn't look good as it was in the low 10,000 range, but it was the inaugural show and they had to start somewhere. Many were optimistic, but for a federation that had everything going for it, it started to have everything going against it. (1992) was a year that started with more momentum than the last for the WBF. Lou Ferrigno was announced to be making his return to competition after 17 years of retirement from the sport. He would feature in the WBF magazines and was on the Body Stars TV show, which McMahon started at this time. The show featured all the guys and would try to build up momentum as well as excitement for the sport that had never been seen before. And it didn't succeed. The show ran to a meager audience and struggled to stay on the air, leading to all the advertisers pulling out, and Vince had to start paying out of his own pocket to keep the show on air. They set up a rivalry between Lou and champion Gary Stridham to really build up momentum for the coming show, but following his appearance, however, Ferrigno would pull out of the WBF without much announcement, and because of this, the main rivalry between the two biggest bodybuilders in the federation was over before it had even started. His replacement? Lex Luger, a wrestler at the time who was signed to join the WWF. Now Lex was known for his great physique at the time, as one of the greatest in the wrestling industry. Due to this, he was cast to be a guest poser for the WBF. He too starred on the Body Stars show, this time as a co-host for Vince McMahon. In this, he played a heel character to Gary Stridham, setting up yet another rivalry for the 1992 show. Tragedy would strike the WBF once again though. Shortly before the show, Lex was involved in a motoring accident and would be hospital-ridden before and during the show. This meant that there was no rivalry in the show at all. Now, not only would there be issues before the show, but there would be constant issues surrounding the upcoming show that made it hard to even want to watch it. Sometimes your biggest rival, much like the IFBB, is yourself. Off the back of the previous year's show, the WBF decided to double down on the theatrics and go even further into what people didn't want in the show. With demonstrations of pure over-the-top entertainment for the sake of entertainment, it meant people were switching off and not taking it seriously at all. With bodybuilders keeping hold of their characters, they would go further and further into depth and try to flesh out the value of them. Have a look for yourself at the antics they were trying to pull.
Hey, relax. You're gonna be in here for a while, big boy.
I can guarantee after the showcase, Dorian Yates was not regretting his decision. One of the biggest enemies apart from itself was his biggest rival. The 1990 Olympia was a huge misstep with a poor lineup, but what followed wasn't. After Dorian declined the offer, he continued to be in the IFBB's roster, making the Olympia have some incredible physiques such as Lee Haney, Dorian Yates, and Sean Ray. Now, although the WBF had some impressive physiques, it paled in comparison to the IFBB lineup, and that would have been nothing compared to what was coming. Now, that was an issue for the WBF as it was hiring yesteryear's stars. For instance, Mike Christian, Barry DeMay, and Gary Stridham were placing well in the Olympia previously, but prior to signing to the WBF, they were starting to place worse and worse in each show. In addition to this, the bodybuilders who went from the IFBB to the WBF were the ones who in fact failed the drug test the IFBB imposed on them at the time. Now with a lackluster cast of bodybuilders, they were failing to catch up to the new stars. This made bodybuilding fans want to see something new that the WBF couldn't present, apart from someone like Jim Quinn, who was known for his incredible mass and conditioning but was not on par with Dorian Yates. And in turn, they had to compensate with over-the-top entertainment. And it showed as the turnout was much less than the year prior, as the fans were being alienated, deciding to focus on the more established and celebrated federation in the IFBB. But perhaps its biggest critic wouldn't come from the opposition, but it would come from back home. If your rival isn't yourself or your enemy, maybe it's your ally. Since its inception and subsequent hiring of the bodybuilders, Vince McMahon showed immense favoritism to all the bodybuilders he had just hired over his golden goose that was the WWF and his wrestlers. Many wrestlers at the time were demanding more and more pay for their work, and here was Vince paying out millions of dollars for a failing federation. Everywhere they went, the bodybuilders were flown in first class and chauffeured around. The wrestlers were not shown such treatment. This led to them hating each other's companies off the back of unfairness and inequality within the McMahon Corporation. But when the wrestlers and bodybuilders were at the end of their patience and they couldn't get enough of each other, they were about to find themselves in the same disaster which neither of them could escape. At a time so divisive for the sport of bodybuilding and wrestling, they had something very daunting in common that the athletes of either sport couldn't run from, a problem they had both been running from for decades. With new laws and regulations implemented which would put more and more of a chokehold on the sports that were run, neither could keep denying the accusations of steroid use. The IFBB at the time combated this by testing its competitors, however this leads to poor turnouts in shows, yet it was a solution. As time went on though, Vince McMahon was given more and more opportunities and he had to do something about the problem.
That the WWF has one of the most comprehensive drug testing, education, and rehabilitation programs in all of sports. This program will now be expanded to include testing for anabolic steroids. In short, the standards of excellence the athletes in the WWF live by will become the standard bearer for all professional sports for years to come. That's why when you see this symbol, you can be assured of drug-free sports entertainment that you and your entire family can be proud of.
With the IFBB being ragged for its poor turnouts and lack of interesting competitors, the WBF had ample opportunity to take over, but what ultimately was going to be its golden opportunity was in itself its cause of death. Vince McMahon had to drug test his competitors for the show, leading to the bodybuilders of the 1992 show looking out of shape with people like Mike Quinn and Danny Padilla having clear belly fat that went over their posing trunks and love handles that jiggled as they posed. This isn't bodybuilding, and the audience thought the same way, leading to an absolute poor turnout from both the audience and the pay-per-view audience. Some cities even reported an audience in the tens who paid to watch the show. Vince McMahon had spent millions at this point and he had just lost it all. His plan to make bodybuilding mainstream had just backfired, with audience turnouts worse than even some novice shows and definitely smaller than any IFBB show. Vince's confidence that he had for his promotional skills to promote and sell the show had truly been diminished. A month after the 1992 showing, Vince called the Weider Company and spoke to Joe Weider. On this call, he announced he was shutting down operations.